HEARTS is a mindfulness-based coaching program that works with developing resilience and well-being. This acronym stands for How the Mind Works, Engaging with Choice, Attention and Noticing, Resilience, Turning Towards Difficulty, and finally Self-Care and Well-being. So let's begin the program by looking at some considerations around how the mind works that may be helpful as we examine the building of resilience and well-being, sometimes in the face of difficulty and challenge. So in this first presentation then, we will look at negative bias, the concept of don't believe everything you think, default thinking, and rumination and catastrophizing, which are common errors that we all experience from time to time. In order to do this, we do need to go back to our prehistoric ancestors and revisit their reptilian brain, which they had. A brain that was far less developed and sophisticated than the brain that we now possess, which has developed and grown over the centuries to adapt to new challenges. That prehistoric reptilian brain of our forefathers had a strong negative bias, and it was this negative bias that kept these people safe and alive. In the midst of dangerous animals like the saber-toothed tiger, who themselves struggled for survival, survival was also key for our prehistoric ancestors. So when they saw a bush move or heard an unfamiliar noise, they automatically thought the worst. This is a threat, something that will harm me. And while 99 times out of 100 it was nothing, it was this negative bias to think the worst kept them alive for another day. Presuming the worst was their safety. While our brain has become far more sophisticated and has adapted to many changes over the centuries, we still retain that negative bias. The brain that expects the worst. It alerts us to the worst possible scenarios. It remembers far more about the bad experiences and very often predicts the future with a negative bias. So because of this negative bias, it's important not to believe everything we think, because very often we think the worst without good reason. It can be helpful to remember too that thoughts are just thoughts. That's all. In a moment they are gone, and they do not exist. However, there is another scenario around thoughts. We can choose to hold on to them and allow them to bubble away in our minds until eventually, particularly in the case of negative thoughts, they undermine us and negatively influence our behavior and our attitude. Two thought processes that we often experience as a result of this are rumination and catastrophizing. Rumination generally relates to past events, playing and replaying them over and over in our minds, while catastrophizing often relates to the future and our tendency to expect the worst of situations and people, even of our own performance. Mark Twain once remarked that I've spent most of my life worrying about things that have never happened. There is something that we can identify too with this. The final consideration that we will look at this part of the training program is the section that deals with default thinking. And when we speak about default thinking, it means that the mind learns certain tasks and performs them by memory. An example of this might be learning to drive the car. At first, it's wearing and exhausting, becoming familiar with signals, the clutch, the brake, lights, mirrors, gears, traffic, lanes of traffic, other drivers, etc., etc. However, once we master the task, it becomes very little effort. It becomes a learned process and does not tax us at all. As I come down the stairs in the morning, do I lead with my right foot or my left foot? I don't know. It happens automatically. When I lift a cup of coffee to take a drink, I automatically know the weight of it. The effort required to lift it, tilt it so that I don't spill it. These are all learned behaviours and tasks. The mind needs to work off this default mode at times so that it spares its energy, it saves itself for the more difficult tasks that require a different type of an attention and a different type of intervention. This does have implications for us also, because it's not just our behaviour that becomes learned and performed in a default mode. At times too, our attitude to people, to tasks, to challenges, to commitments, etc., these too tend to become learned and not challenged. So, not only do we tend to have a mind with a negative bias that spends a lot of time ruminating around the past or thinking the worst about the future, it's also prone to default ways of thinking and behaviours that sometimes are unexamined and do not serve us well, and sometimes that is outside of our awareness. Staying alert and noticing how our mind works can be helpful. It can give us back some control, and it can allow us to choose our responses to better effect.